We've been going through this sermon series on heart issues. We started out several weeks ago talking about the issues of the heart. We all have issues of the heart. We all deal with things internally that are not always exhibited externally, but eventually you do start to see the fruits of some of those things, and the habits many times that we have play into that. And over the next few weeks, we've talked last week about unforgiveness and dealt with unforgiveness, and we talked a little bit about what it means to have unforgiveness and bitterness, and then forgiving is the way that we overcome this issue, this heart issue of bitterness and unforgiveness. Bitterness says that I deserve some sort of retribution for what's been done to me. It's an you owe me mentality. Today I want to talk about I owe me mentality. An I owe me mentality. It's what's mine is mine because I earned it. It's called greed. And some of us, we're not quite fully cognizant of greed in our own life, but it's this I owe myself mentality. And over the next few weeks, we'll also talk about guilt, which is the I owe you mentality. I did something wrong, so I owe you something in return. And then also this jealousy mentality, which says God owes me. Why isn't God fair? And so we'll talk a little bit about that as well. But greed hides a lot behind certain virtues. That's why many times it's hard for us to identify greed in our life. But the Bible talks a lot about greed. And it actually deals a lot with the issue of greed. All throughout Scripture, we see issues of greed creep up in people's lives. And once again, it's this idea that I owe me, that I worked this way, I worked hard, I toiled hard, and so therefore I should have what I have earned, I should have it for myself. And it's a self-reliance on your abilities, knowing that your ability is given to you by God. Despite that, we still deal with the issue of greed. And like I said before, it hides a lot behind certain virtues. Cautious saving, cautious planning. It's easy to spot greed in other people who are so overly cautious, but it's sometimes hard for us to identify it in ourselves. It's like the person who's overweight and they want to go to they say, well, you know what, I'm not really overweight. I just have a healthy appetite. I like good food. And it's not until you go to the doctor and they say there's something wrong, your metabolism isn't working the way that it ought to, you've got to curb your appetite. You got to deal with the issue, because the overweight is just a symptom of things that are going on inside of you. And so it is with greed, with any issue of the heart. These things that we're always looking at and addressing symptoms rather than looking at the heart of the problem. The problem, of course, is that treating the symptom only masks the real culprit. Worse, it delays treatment of that problem, leaving that problem to worsen and grow in your life. Greed hides behind these virtues that I talked to you about. So I want to ask yourself, do some self-examination. Ask yourself a few questions. Here, I'm gonna pose them to you. And then as I ask each one of them, I want you to be honest with yourself. Do I talk a lot and worry a lot about money? Number 2, does it bother me when people ask me for money? Does it bother me when people ask me for money? Am I reluctant to share? Number 3, am I reluctant to share? Number 4, am I a sore loser? Number 5, do I scrutinize every single dollar and cent that I spend? Number 6, do I talk as if I don't have enough to get by with? Do I create a culture of secrecy around me? Number 8, do I remember every single person who owes me? Number 9, am I reluctant to say thank you? Number 10, am I discontent with what I have? Number 11, do I attempt to control people using my resources? Ask yourself, if there was a yes in any one of those, and I will tell you, this self-examination, these are actually questions that therapists use to analyze whether or not there's a root of greed in your life. And if you answered yes to any one of those questions, I can assure you of this, that your family knows that you are greedy. You may not know it, but your family lives it every single day. They see it in you. Why? Because it's easy for others to spot greed in our hearts, but it's hard for us to spot greed in our heart. And it's not one of those things that we always look at and say, well, that's the problem. I'm greedy. When we think of greed, we think of this overt Scrooge mentality. Well, it's mine. They can work it out themselves. Why do they want my money? And sometimes it's not so overt for us. Sometimes it's not so out in the open for us. Sometimes it is some of these things that we hide behind these virtues. Well, that wasn't in the plan. How many of you remember your first car? Anybody here? Yeah, mine was a Buick. It was not that good. I think it was an 85 Buick Century. Worse than like the low end of Buick. You know, the liner just started peeling down out of nowhere. You poke a hole, put super glue on there, stick it up, and you're like, yeah, all right. And then a few weeks later, it still drops again. It was one of those, it was just a poorly made car. I was driving down the road one time, and we're going to come to this curb getting off of the interstate, and we're hitting this curb, and all of a sudden my car starts going around in circles, and I'm like, I felt like I'm about to die. So, the car wasn't the object of my affection. However, I took it to Great Lakes right after boot camp to my A school. It was my gift. My dad had given it to me on graduation, and I wanted to fully enjoy it. However, they did not allow me to park that car on base. I had to pay the train station that was outside the base gates to store my car. Well, I get a call from the police one day. And they say, your car's been stolen. And immediately my heart jumps up. I'm like, who would steal my car? That's my car. I had a love for the car at that moment. Well, they had taken the column and they had broken out the column and used a screwdriver to turn on the ignition. And they had left it on 3 tires. But I saw that, it was messed up. I had a donut. I took a donut. This is the worst story. I don't recommend this to anybody. I put a donut on the car, and I drove it from Great Lakes, from Chicago, all the way down to Fort Myers. I'd never recommend this to anybody. It was the dumbest thing I have ever done. I mean, truly, the dumbest thing I have ever done. Don't ever do that. You hear me, y'all? Don't ever do that. Just take it in. Get a $40 used tire. Don't ever ride it on a donut. Anyway, but all of a sudden, my affections for that car changed. Because while I didn't realize that there was a root of greed over my car, I wanted that car. I wanted to have that car with me. I wanted that car to be my car. It was my car. How dare somebody mess with my car? It's my car. There's an element of greed that's in everything that we interact with many times. And it doesn't surface many times until it affects how we view what we've been given. It affects how we treat those things and how we react to those things that we've been entrusted with. Because if you can react in a certain way over what you have been entrusted with, The devil knows that he can change your affections from it being a tool to it being something that holds you. Can I tell you, fear is a driving force behind greed. Fear fuels greed. I remember one time we were on a vacation, a family vacation, and we were in the mountains, and Jasenia had this camera. And she was going to use this camera because she wanted to take a picture of these mountains. And now there was a cliff that was in front of us. And you remember this, Joanne? There was this side rail. And Jasenia wanted to take a picture of this camera. And the whole time she kept holding out the camera in front of her over the side of this cliff, over this guardrail. And she kept, and my heart was like, you got to be careful. Don't drop that camera. Don't drop that camera. Y'all know what I'm talking about because some of y'all do that too. And you're more worried about the camera than you are about the child. Oh, I know. I'm telling myself today. But I want to tell you, fear is the fuel. It is the driving force behind greed. The what ifs. There's security in knowing that you have stored up things, that you have saved up things, that you have placed guardrails, that you have placed protection over your things, that you've earned enough, that you've done enough planning. Fear is an ego issue. It literally edges God out. And so does greed, because once again, the underlying issue with greed is that you fear that you're not going to do or have what you need. And so therefore, you're edging God out. You're not trusting God for what He can provide for you in your life. Jesus talks about this. Listen, Luke chapter 12, starting in verse 13. Someone in the crowd said to him, they called out to Jesus. So Jesus is talking to this crowd and he's instructing them. And all of a sudden, in the middle of him teaching, somebody cries out and they say this, "Teacher, please tell my brother to divide our father's estate with me, or my inheritance with me." But he said to him, "Man, who made a judge or an arbiter over you?" And he said to them, "Take care and be on guard against all greed or all covetousness. For one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions." And he told them a parable, saying that the land of a rich man produced plentiful. And he thought to himself, "What will I do? For I have nowhere to store my crops." And he said, "I will do this. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones. And there I will store all of my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry." Because that's how my soul would talk to me. It would be an old Southern gospel preacher. But God said to him, "Fool, this night your soul is required of you, and the things that you have prepared, whose will they be? So is the one who lays up treasures for himself and is not rich towards God." I want to read that verse again. "So is the one who lays up treasures for himself and is not rich towards God." And he said to his disciples, "Therefore I tell you, do not be anxious about your life and what you will eat, about your body and what you will put on. For life is more than the food, and the body more than clothing." Now, if you look at this parable, initially you say, what was wrong with him taking of the excess and building a bigger barn? That just makes sense, right? That's a principle that they teach you in business school. If you have to store more, then you just build bigger barns, and if you have more stuff, then you rent out a rental space somewhere, a warehouse, and you put it in the warehouse because you want to have enough for to distribute throughout the life. I mean, even God even used the wisdom of Joseph to be able to store up for those years where there was going to be famine in the land, when they would take from the plenty and prepare for the lack, the times of lack. And that's not at all what Jesus is talking about here. As a matter of fact, look at the underlying question. The guy says, "Teacher, tell my brother to give me my" what? "Inheritance. I didn't earn it." And so he's like, I did what I should do, but my brother's not doing what he should do. I should have my inheritance. And Jesus answers with this parable that comes out of left field. Because it doesn't deal with inheritance, it deals with the heart. Because once again, the issue is not the money, the issue is the heart. What are you going to do with what's been given to you? The issue is not if I saved throughout my life and provided some sort of educational endowment for my children, or if I provided for my special needs child. The issue is not about me accumulating to take care of what I need to take care of. The issue is, where is my heart with the resources that God has given me on a day-to-day basis? Where is my heart in this? The issue of greed is an issue of the heart. It is not an issue of money. I want to be clear about that. We take that context of the verse where it says money is the root of all evil, but it doesn't say money. It says the love of money is the root of all evil. So we're dealing with a heart issue. The question that we should be asking God is, God, what do you want me to do with the extra that you have given me? What do I do with what you have given me to survive, and then the extra that you've also blessed me with? The problem is, you don't actually have to have extra to be greedy sometimes. You can actually be greedy by not having enough. You see, greed is it's not confined by the socioeconomic status that you live in. You could have a great job, paying a great amount of money, providing for all of your needs, and you still be greedy. You could be living on welfare, barely making it, and still be greedy. Because greed has nothing to do with money. It has to do with how you deal with the money. How you deal with the resources that have been given to you. If you're consuming and saving to the point where there is little or nothing to give, you are being greedy. If you're living above your means, if you are living from Discover Card to Visa, you are living a greedy life. I'm not saying that you shouldn't use Discover or Visa. I use it. We all use credit, but if you rely on taking the credit that's been given to you to live, rather than take the resources that you've been given to live and then be able to parse out a lifestyle in which you can live generously and give and know that you are stewarding what God has given to you, you are living a greedy life. Why? Because greed is not a feeling. Greed, and I'm going to say this and you're going to think about this, and it's going to stick in your head because it's been sticking in my head for the last 2 weeks. Greed is not a feeling, it is a refusal to act when God speaks. Ponder that for a minute. Greed is not a feeling. You don't feel greedy, and that's why it's so hard for us to examine it and say, well, I am dealing with greed. Because it's not a feeling, it is a refusal to act when God speaks to you. I owe myself. I can do this myself. I don't need to share it with someone else. It's all about me. I am self-entitled, self-entrusted. I am selfish. Scripture gives us plenty of examples of how we deal with this issue of greed. But I want to go back to that storyline. I want to go back to this parable. And so listen, he says this. He says, take care and be on guard against all greed. Jesus says that you must be on guard. There are not very many things that Jesus says that you ought to be on guard of. But he says, of this one thing, greed, there is something that you need to be on guard of. This is something that, of all the things that God talks about in Scripture, He brings out the heart issue of greed. He says, be on guard, because you won't necessarily see it. Why? Because for most of us, when we live a life that is God-centered, we've placed God at the front, and so all the other things that we're fighting, all these other issues, we believe that God will keep us from the one issue of greed. We believe that's an area of strength, that God can deal with greed in our hearts because we're dealing with so many other things, spiritually speaking. It's like the guy who, many years ago when the Soviet Union was still a republic, a conglomeration of many nations. It was a strong communist nation, and this guy flew over the most secure area of all of Moscow into Red Square. He flew his airplane into Red Square. You remember this? It was a big thing on the headlines that he flew his little plane into the center of Red Square, that most heavily guarded, most heavily watched area. Why? Because they thought it was so strong, and yet it was a weakness. There was a vulnerability. It was an area that was unguarded, even though it was a strength. And so it is in our own life. We have these areas of unguarded strength. We have the strength. We feel like I can overcome greed. I'm not selfish. I'm called to live a selfless life. And so as I'm living a selfless life, the devil takes little opportunities to plant greed into our hearts. Once again, I said, greed is this idea that I owe myself, that I've worked hard, I've done enough, I've lived the American dream. There's even a show called American Greed. You can watch it on CNBC. One of my favorite shows on CNBC is actually Strange Inheritance. Kind of talks about this as well. On there, and I'll come down this little rabbit trail because that does have to do with what I'm talking about. There was this episode, I know, because I love this show. Joanne, she's like, I don't know why you like the show so much, but it's weird. It's Strange Inheritances. I mean, this is stuff that geeks me up. And so there was this guy on here, and he was a gun collector. I mean, he collected all kinds of war memorabilia, war pistols, war rifles, and he even had an M1 Abrams tank. I mean, he had everything. And he was known for being able to engrave these beautiful replicas and make these replicas of Colt. Colt actually paid him to do some engraving. I mean, this guy was so well known. However, this is what his sons say. His entire life was on this whole thing of gunsmithing and collecting guns. And eventually his wife left him because he mortgaged his house to buy a Revolutionary War era rifle and a cannon. And his wife left him. He never spent time with his kids. His kids were so adamantly against him. Well, he wound up in his late 80s, got diagnosed with some fast-acting tumor in his body. The first thing he did was he went out and reached out to his sons. He said, I'd love to chronicle, some of these things for you. His son, in this episode, it was one of the most moving things. His son says, I don't remember a day in my life that I had the interactions that I had with my father like I did when he knew he was about to die. And that these things that he focused his entire life on were secondary to his relationship with us. How often do we put other things in front of the relationships that God has placed in our lives? How often do we put those things in front? And so Jesus says, guard your heart, because sometimes you won't even see it. Guard your heart. Watch within yourself. And then he gives this example of this guy who has an abundance. He has a bumper crop. And this bumper crop is the biggest bumper crop he has ever experienced. But understand that in that society, people understood. When Jesus said this parable, they understood the agrarian mindset. The agrarian mindset said, if I have a bumper crop, it is because God has blessed me. Not because of anything that I've done, but maybe God is calling me to be generous to someone who doesn't. Where does that come from? Deuteronomy. Go put that up there. Deuteronomy chapter 16 or 15 verse 7 says this. But if there are any poor Israelites in your towns, when you arrive in the land the Lord your God has given you, do not be hard-hearted or tight-fisted towards them. There's another verse in Leviticus that talks about the very same thing. Give generously, without interest. That one took me. I was like, wow. Don't expect anything in return. You see, this idea in this cultural frame set was that this man, he should not have built bigger barns. He should be seeking God's heart for what was provided to him. When God gives, we must first give to God, seek God's will and direction, and then do appropriately with the money and the resource that he has entrusted us, be the appropriate managers of what God has given us. The problem is that when we receive something, we immediately think, well, I earned it. And if I earned it, then I have the right to use it however I want. I want to tell you, be careful when you start saying, I have the right. There must be some framework in your life for the things that you have been entrusted with. It would be like me as a financial advisor being given a check by one of my clients, sending me a check, and then me going out there and saying, I just got a check in the mail, $100,000. I am your manager. I'm the manager for this person. And if I go out and take that $100,000 and start using it up, can I tell you something? I'm in trouble. What do I do if I receive a check? I call the client, say, hey, how do you want me to invest this money? Well, you know what? That causes me to be a fiduciary. That's what the word fiduciary means. One who has been entrusted with the right for finances, just like the person that has given them that right. You're a fiduciary. God has entrusted you with resources, with money, with income, so that you can go to God first and saying, God, how do you want me to use what you have given to me? So God calls out this guy who says, hey, I've got ample goods. I'm gonna store them up. I'm gonna build bigger barns. And I'm going to put it, and then I'm going to do what? I'm going to relax, eat, drink, and be merry. Now, I'm not saying that if God has provided for you to retire early, that you should not retire early. Man, use those opportunities. I know of people that have been, God has blessed them in their youth. I mean, I know millionaires who are in their 30s, multi-millionaires in their 30s. What do they do? What should they do? Should they give it all away? No, they should seek God for what he wants them to do. I know of some who have gone into ministry, and they've used those assets to be able to fund their ministry expenses. And they're doing what God has called them to do. I know others who God has blessed generously, and they have continued to be blessed generously for 20, 30, 40 years. And what they do is that they give a portion to the ministries that they are involved with, to their church. This guy is not that person. Instead, he says, I am going to do what? I'm going to eat, drink, and be merry. I'm not going to ask God why he has given me this. I'm just going to take it for my own self. I owe it to myself. I worked hard in those fields. This is what's due to me. How often do we hear that today? They owe me this. My company owes me this. People owe me this. The government owes this to me. This is an entitlement. And I want to tell you, whatever you have, it is because God has given it to you. God has been generous towards you. God has opened doors for you. Seek his will. Seek to know what he wants. Why? Because listen to this. God says to him, you fool, this night your soul is required of you, and the things that you have prepared, whose will they be? Now, this is not what Jesus is saying. You accumulated wealth, so I'm going to kill you. He's saying you don't know the day or the hour. You don't know the time when the Lord is going to come. So what you're doing, whatever you're doing, make sure that you're doing it as unto the Lord, that you're seeking his will. But if you're doing it because you have a time frame of what you want, be careful. That's not to say that we ought not plan. I want to tell you, you should know where your money is going and how you're spending your money. But listen, it should not dominate your conversations. It should not dominate your life. It should not keep you from having relationships the way that God intended you to have relationships. Proverbs chapter 11, verse 24 and 25 says this, one gives freely, yet grows all the richer. Another withholds what he should give, and only suffers want. Whoever brings blessing will be enriched, and one who waters will himself be watered. He says, if you give, you will receive from the Lord. You will receive the refreshing. If you can learn to hold what you've been giving lightly. Proverbs 22 verse 9 says, whoever has a bountiful eye will be blessed, for he shares his bread with the poor. If you live with a bountiful eye, if you see the Lord as being a good God who is generous towards his people, if you see God as being a magnanimous God, you're more apt to be open-handed with the resources that you have because you know that God will repay you. Jesus taught about this himself in Luke chapter 21, verses 1 through 4. Jesus looked up and he saw the rich man putting their gifts in the offering box. And he saw a poor widow put in 2 copper coins. And he said, truly I tell you, this poor woman has put in more than all of them, for they all contributed out of their abundance, but she out of her poverty put in all that she had to live with. Acts 20, verse 32 through 35, Paul talks about this issue as well. It says, and now I commit you to God and to the message of his grace, which is able to build you up and give you an inheritance among all who are sacrificed. I have not coveted anyone's silver or gold or clothing. You yourselves know that. These hands have provided for my needs and for those who were with me. Listen to what he says. It has provided for my needs and for those who are with me. In every way, I've shown you that by laboring like this, it is necessary to help the weak and to keep in mind the words of our Lord Jesus. For he said, it is more blessed to give than it is to receive. There's a website that I'd like for you guys to check out at some point. It's called generouschurch.com. And in it actually goes through the Bible, showing God's generosity. You want to go through this with me real quick? Real quick. So it says this. It makes this comment. To see how God's generosity and ultimately His love for you is portrayed in all 66 books of the Bible, here's a list of His countless gifts, book by book. Genesis, God gives us life and access to His creativity. Exodus, God gives salvation to the captives. Leviticus, God gives insight to the future and regular reasons for feasts. He says, enjoy this life. Numbers, God gives blessings when the world is calling down curses. God gives water for the thirsty. Deuteronomy, God gives laws to protect us from ourselves, but God also gives the ability to produce wealth. Joshua, God gives His inheritance to those who follow Him. Judges, God gives strength. Ruth, God generously provides protection to the foreigner and the widow. 1 Samuel, God gives victory over fear. 2 Samuel, God gives honor to the broken in Mephibosheth and restoration to the fallen with David and Bathsheba. 1 Kings, God gives proof of His presence in Mount Carmel. 2 Corinthians, God gives vision to the spiritually blind. 1 Chronicles, God gives provisions for His work. 2 Chronicles, God gives talents and abilities. Ezra, God gives His people favor with influential people. Nehemiah, God appoints people to stand in the gap for you while you are down. Esther, God gives influence to the powerless. Job, God gives restoration to the devastated. Psalms, God gives redemption to those enslaved to sin. God gives compassion. He is slow to anger and abounding in love. Proverbs, God gives wisdom. Ecclesiastes, God gives rain and everything else in its proper season. Song of Solomon, God gives human love that is better than wine. Isaiah, God gives a place in His family. Jeremiah, God gives warning and warning after warning before He allows punishment. God gives hope and a future. Lamentation, God gives companionship during your suffering. Ezekiel, God gives life to dry bones. Daniel, God rescues the perishing and brings them into a kingdom that never fails. Hosea, God redeems His lovers who have prostituted themselves with other pleasures. Joel, God gives us back the years that have been stolen by catastrophes. Amos, God gives justice to the abused. Obadiah, God gives judgments that are fair. Jonah, God gives opportunities to repent. Micah, God gives new life to the hopeless. Nahum, God gives a hiding place in tough times. Habakkuk, God gives joy and peace beyond understanding. Zephaniah, God gives His presence and writes love songs for His people. Haggai, God gives specific sovereign purposes to each person. Zechariah, God gives protection, and God gives us a spirit of grace and prayer. Malachi, God gives us stability. He doesn't change. Matthew, God gives His touch to the untouchables. Mark, God gives food to the hungry. Luke, God gives action love, stepping into the pain of creation rather than walking away. He has given us Emmanuel, the incarnation. John, God gives us His word as the way, the truth, and the life in the flesh so that we can understand it. Acts, God gives us community for encouragement and strength. Romans, God gives grace when we don't deserve it, what we deserve is death. God gives insiders the fulfillment of His promises and outsiders a way in. 1 Corinthians, God gives us spiritual gifts beyond our genetically entrusted abilities. 2 Corinthians, God gives us a new life, a new identity in Christ. Galatians, God gives freedom from the harness of slavery. Ephesians, God gives us unity through the cross. Philippians, God gives eternal inheritance in exchange for our punishment. Colossians, God gives us the opportunity to share in His glory. 1 Thessalonians, God gives us grace to handle poor treatment from others. 2 Thessalonians, God gives us eternal encouragement and good hope. 1 Timothy, God gives us His message, entrusting us to teach it to others. 2 Timothy, God gives nearness during trials. Titus, God gives promises of His return. Philemon, God provides forgiveness even to the runaways. Hebrews, God gives us faith and a great cloud of witnesses to cheer us on. James, God gives His ear to our prayers. 1 Peter, God gives us the mindset of Christ. 2 Peter, God gives confirmation of His word. 1 John, God gives remarkable love. 2 John, God gives rewards for following His leadership. 3 John, God gives us the season. God gives us the joy of seeing faith growing in other people. Jude, God gives His people a spotless record. And Revelation, God gives a new heaven and a new earth where there is no more suffering, where there is no more pain. God is a generous God. And what does He require of us? To be generous in our works. 1 Timothy, and I'll close with this. As for the rich in this present age, charge them not to be haughty, not to set their hopes on the uncertainty of riches, but on God, who richly provides us with everything to enjoy. See, God is not a killjoy. He gives us everything to enjoy. They are to do good, to be rich in good works, to be generous and ready to share, thus storing up treasures for themselves as a good foundation for the future, so that they may take hold of that which is true life. I want to challenge you to be generous in the unexpected times. So if God challenges you to go into Walmart, now He's not going to challenge you to go into Walmart. You're walking into Walmart, and then He challenges you. I'm telling you. If you walk into Walmart and God challenges you to buy shoes for somebody who's looking at shoes on the shoe aisle. I was going in to buy shoes for Josiah. I was walking in. There was a homeless person who was looking at shoes. His shoes were all falling apart. I wound up buying this guy a pair of shoes. How many of you have ever been challenged to do that? And how many of us have actually stepped out and did it? If you're at the gas station and you see somebody who's struggling, you know that they're putting that $3 in just to get to the next. And you're challenged. Can I fill up your tank? Be challenged in those kind acts of generosity. Number 2, be generous proportionally. God has called us to be tithers. What that means is that we give a portion, a proportion of what He's given to us. Now, that doesn't mean that immediately some of you who have been struggling, that you just immediately start on that. I want to tell you, if it's hard for you, start with baby steps. Start with 2%. Start with 5%. Work your way to 10%. But I want to tell you this, it's a heart issue more than it is a money issue. It's not a dollar sign amount. It's a heart issue. Work yourself proportionally to where your finances, listen, this is what I'm going to share with you what I share to people. I say 10% of your money should go to God immediately. You should take another 2 to 5% to be generous in other ventures. Take another 10% and prepare for your future. You don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. Whether that's life insurance, whether that's retirement, you should have at least 10% of your income going to fund your future somehow, to take care of your family somehow. Prepare for that. And then take the other 75%. And then understand, Uncle Sam's going to get his 20 to 25, 28, some of you 30. And that's okay. Plan. Plan for that to be gone. And then live on the other 40 or the other 50. That means that your mortgage should not be more than 30% of your income. And if it is, you may need to scale down. Look at how you're living. Look how you're spending your expenses. Make sure that you're providing for your family a foundation for their future. And if you can learn to live proportionally, if you can learn to handle your finances in a proportional way, I challenge you with this. Look at the percentages of how you're spending your money. There are so many tools that are out there now. And start having a habit of giving God His first. If you'll do that, it'll change your life. I'm not saying that because we're about to take up the offering, although we're about to take up the offering. I'm saying that because it will change who you are. It will change how you guard your heart. Heavenly Father, I pray today that we would truly learn to be generous people. That our hearts would be in the right place. Father, the last thing that I ever want said of me is what God said to this farmer. Fool. I don't want to be foolish with my finances. I don't want to be foolish with what you've entrusted me with. I don't want to set a plan in my life that is not according to the plans and purposes that you have for me. And so I ask, God, that you would examine my heart today and that you would reveal to me those areas of weakness in my life where greed has set in, where secrecy has set in with my finances, where areas of issue where I dominate my finances rather than allowing you to dominate me has set in. Teach me to live with my hand open-fisted before you. That as needs arise, that I will be willing to be generous in areas where you have been so generous to us. Teach me to not be foolish.